Hey guys, I am DM Zone. This is Gamers Oasis. What I need you to do right now is to build 3 levels of a dungeon. You need to account for side passages, new construction, collapses, and have at least two entrances. All right? All right, let's get into this video. We're going to talk real quickly. This video is part of a mini series, but we're going to talk real quickly about how in the original Dungeons and Dragons, they worked through a dungeon. We're going to talk about the exploration in this video. The last one I talked a lot about procedure, and the next one I'm going to talk about keeping it weird. So let's go ahead and talk about the experience of going through the dungeon and what that might feel, look, smell, and taste like. Ew, ew. I don't think it's going to be a cotton candy taste. What do you think? So let's go ahead and start with probably one of the more iconic phrases. I kind of hinted at it just a second ago. It says, it is advisable to construct at least 3 levels at once. Okay, like in the very beginning, the party gets made, you're going into a thing, you have a dungeon on the map, you have a village, you have at least one mysterious or weird thing, maybe some roads. That dungeon needs to have 3 levels immediately. A good dungeon would have no less than a dozen levels with several offshoots, several things like that, places under construction, multiple entrances, so that your players never get tired of it. And again, that's sort of paraphrasing the book in addition to what I've already said. And the reason why they go into this in such detail is you have to remember dungeons are new. There are no games out there with dungeons. Even a game that might have come out pretty much at the exact same time, like Traveler, didn't have dungeons. So this is a new thing, and it wouldn't be known what problems you'd be stepping towards. So I'm going to talk about a few points that might help explain why you immediately need to have 3 levels of a dungeon. Beyond the comedy of the fact that it was wrote in that manner, I think there's some good examples in here. Okay, so when we look at a dungeon and its levels, what level the hit dice of the creatures are, how many there are, that type of stuff is based on the level of the dungeon you're in. So if you're in a first level dungeon, you're not going to get as good a loot as if you're in a 6th level of a dungeon. Matter of fact, you're not even going to see one hit dice creatures in a 3rd level of a dungeon. All the creatures are going to be 2nd hit dice or higher. You're also going to have the potential of seeing 6 hit dice creatures by the time you get to the 3rd level. But as the monsters get tougher, ideally, the loot gets better equally with it. So because combat can be kind of avoided through several means. I talked about it a lot in the procedural, so I'm just going to go over it in a gloss fashion here and talk about the fact that you can throw food out for non-humanoids and have a greater chance of it deterring them. You can throw gold and treasure out for intelligent creatures. You can bluff your way through it through means of I'm a bad wizard, don't make me angry, rawr. Okay? And you can work your way through this type of thing, and they don't have any way to really identify it. But let's go ahead and go into this a little deeper. By the time you get to the 3rd level, you're probably done. You probably aren't going to be able to go any farther. But this is the point where people are more whimsical with their characters. First game session, let's go crazy. Let's see if we can go down to the 3rd level. Let's see if we can get a sword or a shield or potions or maybe a hull of some sort of gold, something that we can then take back, sell, level up, or get a really good start. You're probably not going to make it to the 4th, but you can make it to the 3rd and out before anything gets to you, potentially, even if you're by yourself. And giving yourself that extra good start allows you to be more cautious moving forward, because now you got some stuff. Now you're able to do a little bit. Now you're in plate mail with a shield and you have a magic sword. That's when the fighter becomes good. Maybe the magic user gets enough to get more than one spell. That's when they become good. These type of things are what gives the advantage to the Munchkin Power Gamer that probably existed even before this did. They were just playing games with dice like Sortigo and Yahtzee and this type of stuff. But you get the general idea. So why would this work? Well, part of that is, as foolish as it is to get into combat, especially when you're dealing with an unknown quantity or quality, monsters have the same thing. They were designed to be played intelligent. That's why they had the monster reaction. That's going to be sort of our second thing here. So you could bluff your way through this and potentially get them to second guess or maybe have them join you in the fight to be able to get in there. And then the thief or whatever, they didn't have thieves, but you get the general idea. The character who's like the Conan Barbarian, who's a thief, but he's technically a fighter class, goes and steals the object and runs away. And that's kind of how that worked back then. This was using the mechanics of the game to kind of gain an advantage with that. That's why you need to have at least 3 levels, because if you went beyond what the referee had, then you're going to run into problems where, well, I have to make something up. So the map isn't going to be right. The way out may be forgotten. Might be forgotten by next week for sure. I might give something out I don't intend to. I might say there is no 3rd level and just move on. All that is kind of a letdown for the players who were expecting and hoping for a mega dungeon type entrance. So why doesn't a monster or a player know how strong the other is? Well, that's because there's no spells in the game that specifically say this is a 4-hit dice creature. You can get there with spells. For example, if you cast Sleep on a party of 3 ogres, you're not going to affect any of them. You know they're higher than 4 hit dice. If you cast Sleep on 1 ogre, which means it can affect a 4 hit, or it's higher than 3 hit dice. If it casts on 1 ogre, it's going to be 4 plus 1, and then you should be able to affect the ogre, and now you know that a Sleep can take out an ogre type of thing, and that's kind of how you do it, through experience. Now, if you are a player and you quit playing that character and you go and play a different character, they would want you to forget that and start over with that knowledge, because that's kind of the fun of the game. Also, the farther down you go, the more loot you get. Loot is worth experience. So you find 1,000 gold, that becomes 1,000 XP. If you find a magic item, that becomes XP. In original Dungeons & Dragons, they actually take into consider that type of stuff as well. Later, in like BX and whatnot, they don't take into consideration magic items. And I think that was a little bit to avoid this type of stuff. Why wouldn't you want to just slowly, methodically just work your way through a dungeon? Well, that wouldn't be good, because every 20 to 30 minutes in game and everything costs time. So you move, that costs time. You open a door, you listen at the locks, you pick the locks, you cast a heal spell. That takes 10 minutes to cast heal. Every 20 to 30 minutes, you're going to have a wandering monster check. On a d6, you roll a 1, that is an encounter. Wandering monsters can be more dangerous than everything else because they're based off of what level you are, and you have no knowledge, maybe, of what it could be. It might be something that's already there, but you could go in and fight kobolds and run into a bunch of zombies, and that could be a problem because you don't have anything to deal with zombies. Personally, when I run the game, I tend to group things up by what they are. Though I do have this is a wild card, and we're going to have it from the generic list of things that it could be based upon what level it is. I also tend to base loot around kind of what you have there. So I do my random loot and that type of stuff for each rooms, and I kind of have that set up, though I may not know what it is. When I do it, I roll for each room, and if I get an encounter, I take an encounter card for that level and I set it down. And then that room has that encounter card. If I roll loot, then I put a loot card with it that I don't know what they are until they're flipped. Then, when I go and do a wandering monster encounter, well, then I can go ahead and roll for the wandering monster. Wandering monsters don't carry loot. They're not as valuable to fight as the room monsters, which do come with loot. For example, the only one that is kind of different from that I can remember off the top of my head is ogres. Ogres carry basically a d6 times 100 gold coins inside a pouch. They carry their money with them. Everyone else is considered to have left it in their lair. Now, if you don't go back and track where their lair is, you have to assume the place you're in is a lair. Therefore, when I do goblins, I tend to build a goblin lair of whatever, and then the loot I spread out amongst the dungeon. It makes it a little less gonzo and makes it a little bit more loot rich, but it also makes it more loot specific to what you're fighting. If you're fighting a bunch of rats, you're going to run into more things that glitter and shine, like rubies and gems and maybe some gold coins and this type of stuff. You're not going to find the anvil of Thor inside the rats room unless the rats didn't put it there. It was always there, and it has remained there and probably will remain there after you and the rats leave. Okay, so now let's go ahead and talk about some of the senses and how it assails you, or how you don't really have the same type of reaction. If you've read the Dying Earth series books by Jack Vance, it talks about the overworld and it talks about basically the underworld and how they are different. They're sort of their own living beings that work against the party in many ways. Dungeons, the doors shut automatically. Unless you prop them open, put something in the way, they just shut. There's a chance the door will shut. They don't open for you. You have to force them open. If you fail to force them open, they do have rules for getting through it, but it's not advantageous for you. For example, if a giant tries to go through a door that has shut, it takes half its movement. So it can move half its movement and basically not even stop and go through the door. However, if a human being, or a party member in this case, decides it wants to go through a door, it's going to take 10 combat rounds, which could be 3 dudes on a door taking basically 4 turns, 4 rounds of combat to get through a door. Or you're going to have to make a strength check to get through it. If you roll your 1 and fail, then you fail. Before they came out with the supplement 1, the best you could hope for is like a 5 or a 4 and 6 chance that you're going to get out of this area with a +3 strength. That's about the best you can hope for. If you were not strong, then you have basically you have to roll a 6 on a d6 to get through that door. And which means if you were the magic user and you were the last one alive, you could very well be trapped behind a door and have to spend 10 rounds of beating on the door with something to try and get through it and not draw attention. Sound is the next big thing that is a thing that you have to get through. So sound eliminates the chance for them to be surprised. You can still be surprised, but it eliminates the chances for them to be surprised. Light is also a thing that if you are holding a light, you can be surprised, but you can't surprise anyone because of that reflection of light. Now you have let's say a box and you put it over and all the light is basically stifled, then you have a chance of being able to sneak up on those things. However, there is some discussion about whether dwarves and elves can see actually in the dungeon's light, or do they need some sort of thing like a moonstone which allows them to be able to see, because it creates basically a slight magical glow to everything and they're able to see it. There's some debate on that. We'll get into more on that in the Let's Keeping Dungeons Weird type of thing. That's a working title. It's also important to remember location, location, locations. Dungeons don't tend to be directly where you are resting. There are places where there's the tavern, and then you go from the tavern and you go into the dungeon. There are locations like that. Several examples. Often, you are a half day away from the dungeon and or at a town, and you have to walk to the dungeon. There's that back and forth. You could be ambushed in between. People could set up a trap for you to try and steal your loot. These type of things. You could be trying to sneak back to town because you're at very little hit points because everyone in the party has been beaten up and you're dragging 2 unconscious members type of thing. And you're just trying to make it. This is where wilderness becomes a bit of a thing. And they recommend outdoor survival. I have my reservations on that. I've done a couple of videos on that. I recommend going to go check those out if you're interested in that type of stuff. But let's stick with the dungeons. So you go back into the dungeon. The question is, has it changed? How long were you gone? It takes a week essentially to rest, get refreshed, and go back into a dungeon. And then you're probably back out within a day. So unless you have 5 or 6 other people, you're probably going to have time when other things could be going in and out, especially if you start taking into consideration that wandering monsters could technically go there and you wouldn't have anything to do with it. That's more of a referee's discretion. However, there are literal modules that came out just after original Dungeons and Dragons, like Keeping the Borderland, that talks about the refreshing of dungeons. What it would be like to have them refreshed in those 2 weeks, 3 weeks you're gone really makes a big difference because now new things can come in there. What's important to note is that orcs could repopulate this area, and if they do, you're going to be looking at between 3 and 30 orcs. No, times that by 10. 30 to 300 orcs. That is a lot of orcs. Now, this is also followed immediately after the caveat that up to the discretion of the referee, because there may not be space for 300 orcs to live inside there, which then means that you would have potentially like a Blackmoor type game where they have an army on the surface and then they have bad guys down below, and your army goes against their army. You win, and then some flee into the dungeon and you fight them in the dungeon, making a very Braunstein-like game where you might have some party members going into the dungeon to try and take out the leadership so that the army above is easier to kill. Making, I guess, sort of like multiple times in J.R.R. Tolkien's works where multiple armies come together and then Gandalf comes swooping in or flying in with eagles type of thing. And that would be a way that this game could be played. Braunstein was actually made by Dave Wesley, a friend of Dave Arneson. Dave Arneson actually ran many of these games. I have a whole thing called The Grandfather of RPGs talking about Braunstein. Braunstein was actually more of a LARP versus an actual tabletop roleplay game. So I won't talk much about it here. But I do recommend going back if you really want to know about that type of stuff. So if you're inside a dungeon, you have to get to what we call a safe haven. You can either have it inside a dungeon itself, or you could have it outside the dungeon, making it a little bit of a track. Let me go ahead and show you what a map that I made looks like. This here is a map I made for what I call Called. Now, I'm not going to talk about Called, C-A-L-D, but basically it was Champion Archives Living Dungeon. That was the map for my local game store, my LGS. And inside there, I had things that I had random encounters, wandering monsters that would happen. And when I would do these, I did it very simply like this. A roll a d6, a 1 equals a weak encounter, a 2 and a 3 equals a moderate encounter, a 4 and a 5 equals a moderate encounter, plus a bonus encounter of some sort of nature. So what would that look like? That would be like a party of 5 runs into a D3 plus 3 rats. So potentially more rats than players, but not likely. You're going to have was it 1.5 plus 3 rats, so 4.5 rats. So on average, it's going to be right there at the party member. Now the bonus might be there's a goblin that is the pack master who is then trained these rats to do that. So not only is the pack master there, but the pack master I would have carry some sort of provisions for rats that you could use to then deter other rats in the future, because what would the rat master, I guess you could say pack master, have that rats would listen to him for? Either a whip, which would be potential to have or break or whatever, or food or something of that nature that would give you a benefit. So that's what the bonus is. It's like bonus with a teeth. In this case, it would be the rat pack master. And if you rolled a 6, it'd be a strong encounter. So while you may still have pack masters, you just run into a very large pack with a pack master, depending on what level, or maybe you run into 2 packs. And instead of having a D3 plus 3, you would have a D6 plus 3, or you'd have a D3 plus 5, and that would become a strong encounter. And whoa, if you happen to run into, 2 D3 plus 6 type encounters, would be total of plus 6. So 2D3 plus 6 would be a pretty rough encounter for a party of 5 first level characters. But 1 sleep spell would probably allow you to win. I normally keep these on 3x5 cards, and I usually take the card and I put it down below the thing. If and when an encounter checks, I just go ahead and flip the top card, and that becomes the thing. If I know that there is a non-wandering monster card in there, I'll literally take it, and then on the back I'll write what room it is, and I'll set it aside. And then when it comes time to go to that room, I just flip the card over, and bingo, bango, bongo, I have them all sealed in that thing, or I'll write on it directly, and that's how I do that, and I'll just go ahead and erase it. That's how I do it. I'm not going to get too much into supplements, but supplement 1 helps a lot with being able to go through a dungeon because of the increased strength, and some additional things like the thief class, which is a wildly, mostly important type of thing. But it also gets into other things like the druid, the ranger, the monks, these type of things, assassins, which adds some depth to your game. When you get into Blackmoor, you start running into things like the paladin. I think actually that's where the ranger comes from. And that type of stuff, the druid, the paladin, you get a wider variance of things. You also start running into the half-breed stuff, like half-orc and half-elf, in addition to the dwarf, human, elf, halfling. I would say gnomes would probably fit very easily in there too. However, gnomes were actually considered to be a monster race, even though they were lawful. They were really kind of looked down upon. And I think that if a character wanted to play that and be that way, I think that actually makes a lot of sense. And in one of the strategic reviews, you run into the gnome illusionist type of thing. And I think that is decent enough, but I just don't think there's enough illusionary stuff in the early game to really be able to warrant it without the referee and the player coming up with a bunch of things for themselves to be able to do that better. There's also a lot of holes, and I'm getting to some the real juicy stuff here. And I hope you like it. There's a lot of holes in original Dungeons and Dragons that I like to fill. Things like swarms. Having a bat swarm that's less interested in you and not really an intelligent attacking creature, but more of a distractionary, flies by and has a potential to cause disease in the party because of the feces traveling through the area. Maybe some of the bats potentially bite you. And now there's a potential for like rabies. Those diseases and those type of things are actually covered in the supplement 2 for Blackmoor. Partially. There are other things you can get that from in addition, but that's a great place for it. But you don't have to stop there. You could have rats, you could have bats, you could have beetles, You could have grubs. And a swarm doesn't have to be a in-your-face swarm. It might be every night you're in these hallways, there's a chance you're going to wake up if you actually try and sleep, or if you set your bag down, that you're going to have a chance that cockroaches are going to crawl inside your backpack and start eating your food, or disease in your food. There's a chance that you're going to be bit by a mosquito. There's a chance that the spiders in this area are going to actually harm you in some way. There's a chance as you're going through maybe an above ground type of dungeon where there's some sort of vegetation or a swamp that could be under or overground, that you could have leeches or ticks or those type of things. They don't have to be completely in your face. They could just be, you can't heal while you're here. These type of environments really kind of bring the dread into this dungeon. Then placing safe havens within inside your dungeon where maybe enough priests of enough alignments of enough gods have cast bless to create a sanctuary for all. And a special fungus grows there. And when you are in that room eating the fungus, you just heal a D2 wounds overnight. And the fungus or the moss or whatever it is or the water refreshes you and you don't feel like you're hungry. Wow. What you could do in a dungeon like that and how much that would become the hub with inside a dungeon. And if you were to know that and another party did not know that, how important would that be if you're competing against each other? And might two neutral to lawful good parties, or lawful parties, there is no lawful good yet, actually fight because they don't want to allow someone else into the room because there's enough room for 4 or 5 people, not 10. Yeah, I think that there's a lot to this type of environment. Some of the other stuff you really need to take into consideration when you're talking about what the environment of the dungeon is like. How many torches do you have? Do you have backup light sources? Did you use a flask of oil and a torch to start a fire down this hallway? Does that smoke go your way or a different way out? Do you follow the smoke out? Is that how you exit the dungeon? There's a lot of things like that would be very interesting. Maybe the way out of the dungeon is not accessible by you, but that's the direction the smoke goes, and it takes you to a large room, and now you have a fight. Lots of things like that. Is there a food source inside your dungeon that you can eat? Let's say giant crickets. There are times when people have survived off of those type of things. Are there albino blind fish that travel in the water? Are these fish aggressive? Are these fish so big that all the party knows is, I don't know where the halfling went. There was a wallop of a splash that soaked everyone, a flash of white light as the halfling disappeared and his torch went out. We have no idea what happened. Maybe you're going along and crabs come out of the water and they start to attack you, then drag you back into the water. Maybe there's a underground river and you see a war band of goblins traveling down this underground river and you're having to reconsider life and what you're doing. Maybe you attack it, maybe you steal one of their boats, and then where do you go? You don't know where these underground rivers go. Man, a lot of exciting and interesting things can come from that. I am barely scratching the surface. When I did my call dungeon, so many things led back into each other. My puzzles would span rooms, would have clues, would have encounters. You'd run into NPCs that would tell you how to interact with things. Those type of things can happen. Maybe You go into a room and there's long black stones and long white stones, and the stones seem to be systematically apart. And then you go over and you see a bunch of numbers on the wall, or you see a piano, and you're like, are those the keys to the piano, or does that have to do with the numbers? Maybe I have to push these numbers in a sequence, like maybe the order which are on the wall, or the reverse of it, or the vertical of it, or whatever it might be, to play a song to have something happen. Or maybe I have to put, let's say, objects on each one of the third, fourth, and fifth stone, or whatever, and then something happens. Puzzles are its own little thing. I'm probably going to get into some sort of like puzzles and these type of things in a whole different video, but it's part of the environment of what you're going through. And what you leave behind should and could be found by other party members. What you find should and could have been left by other party members. If time is universal and it's one timeline and all these things are happening back to back, that makes for an awesome story. If they're not, it's okay. It doesn't have to. It's a live record keeping. Trust me, I know. But if that is a thing you're not doing, it doesn't mean you can't act like that's what happened. As long as your players don't know that none of that is true, and you remember at least what your players did, then everything else feels and seems like it's actually a thing. Anyways, guys, I'll see you guys in the next video. Keep rolling those dice and have a good one.